Welcome to Cinemophile, where we bring you the best in independent, documentary, and foreign films, and we talk to the people who made them. I'm your host, Mike Caspar, and you can find out more about the program by going to cinemaphilepod.com. Premiering on October 27th on one of PBS's flagship programs, American Experience, is a two-part, 3-hour biography of Henry Kissinger called Kissinger. It offers an insightful portrait of him, the enigmatic powerbroker who served in the topmost echelons of American diplomacy. Whether celebrated or reviled, Kissinger's contradictions reflect those at the heart of American foreign policy during the second half of the 20th century, a period in which America became the unchallenged superpower in the world. It often pursued policies at odds with its highest ideals. It's all of that and more. Needless to say, as I alluded to in the introduction, Henry Kissinger was certainly a controversial figure. And in many ways, we are either reacting to or embracing Kissinger's worldview from many different presidencies since he left office. We're joined today by the director of Kissinger, and that would be Barak Goodman. Barak, welcome to Cinemophile.
Thank you so much for having me.
As mentioned before we got started, lived during this period of time when Henry Kissinger was the voice of American foreign policy and had a tremendous impact on our country and the direction of our country, especially when it came to foreign policy. Let's talk a little bit about what spurred you to this particular project and why now.
Well, like you, I grew up in the era of Henry Kissinger's foreign policy and took it for granted that the United States was the dominant force and power in the world. But that is something I've learned one can't take for granted. It was very much something that was engineered and created, as it were, by largely by Henry Kissinger's foreign policy. So when he died, it was clear to me that it was the moment to do this, and I called PBS and got the fastest green light I'd ever gotten on a project. They too saw that the merits. With him passing, there were people now who would speak who probably wouldn't have spoken had he still been alive. So that was the genesis of the project.
If you were to frame a person of this era in terms of their importance in American foreign policy, let's say since, I don't know, let's say 2015, in terms of, no, that's an arbitrary date, but is there anyone that you feel holds that position that Henry Kissinger did?
No, I don't think there's anyone that even comes close to the power and influence that Kissinger wielded. I have to say he did so with the president, Richard Nixon, who was very much encouraging of it and interested in foreign policy. I don't think there's been an equivalent figure since. We can talk about actually some of Kissinger's proteges, a guy like Zbigniew Brzezinski, for example, or Brent Scowcroft is another who was, a Kissinger protege. He had a long list of sort of, you think of coaches' trees in the NFL. This is sort of national security tree. He had a lot of proteges who went on to do important, significant things, but none of them matched the sheer reach and power of this man. Not even close, I don't think.
Yeah, I'm thinking back. Robert McNamara comes to mind, but they're of the same sort of era. There's a certain connection that they had. But yeah, I think you're right. There isn't anyone that comes close.
Well, it's interesting you bring up McNamara. The similarity there is the brilliance. This was a man, like McNamara, who had a kind of a freakish mind, a kind of mastery of both the arcana of foreign policy. So he knew things about nuclear weapon payloads and sort of trajectories and things like that, and also just a kind of strategic vision. I'd say even more than McNamara. So that is an interesting analogy. But even there was a period of time when Nixon was greatly weakened by Watergate, where you could say that Kissinger was the most powerful man in the world, certainly in the United States, and was really basically conducting foreign policy on his own. He was a sort of second president and an important figure because the country had lost faith in government and lost faith in the president and the executive branch. And Kissinger was very much seen as kind of the only adult in the room, the last man standing in that administration who had credibility and was someone who people had faith in. He sort of emerged as this sort of foreign policy superhero. They called him Super K. We forget now how both reassuring a figure he was, but also, so controversial even in his own time.
You mentioned the obvious connection with Richard Nixon, President Nixon. Let's talk about this time frame. I know it's a broad question, but I'll kick it off by starting up the conversation about this time by saying that when Richard Nixon came into office, he inherited what I think can be talked about in terms of the worst foreign policy blunder in American history,
Yeah.
at least up to that point. How would you frame Vietnam, Richard Nixon's ascendancy to the presidency, and Henry Kissinger in the frame? Well, how would you
It
characterize?
dominates. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And one has to assess the legacy of these men by understanding the context in which they were operated. You're absolutely right. They inherited this mess. This was not something they created. We think now today of the Kissinger-Nixon axis as being sort of this belligerent, sort of warmongering duo, but they weren't. Nixon ran on a platform of ending the war. Kissinger had already, before he became part of the administration, just as an academic, had already concluded that Vietnam was unwinnable. So they both had the vision or the idea that they would be ending the war. The question was how, and this is where it got into trouble because neither Nixon nor Kissinger were willing simply to walk away, and nor were most Americans at that point. The idea that you would just kind of withdraw, leave the South Vietnamese government to the mercies of the North Vietnamese, sort of sell out was the word they used. And there was a lot of sunk costs at this point, lives and treasure. It was very hard to imagine the United States government simply unilaterally withdrawing. So what did they do? Well, this was the fatal mistake you allude to, I think. I think they both concluded that they could exercise enough leverage, bring enough pressure on the North Vietnamese, either through military action or through alliances with the Chinese and the Soviet Union. They could bring enough pressure for the North Vietnamese to simply pull back and negotiate. And this was where Kissinger failed. He misjudged. Very rare for him to misjudge his, interlocutor across the table, but he did misjudge the North Vietnamese. He did not understand their motivation, their passion, their history. And so he made a series of mistakes that prolonged the war and cost many, many thousands of lives.
Thank you, because you can't talk about Kissinger without Vietnam coming to mind. There were
Yeah,
other things in the film. There's a lot of other chapters in his career
yeah,
as America's National Security Advisor and Secretary of State as well. So there are a lot. But I want to go back to the beginning where he came from, how sort of
yeah,
his foundational story, which I was not familiar with. So I
yeah.
want to say thank you so much for essentially setting the stage for our understanding of Henry Kissinger moving forward. Let's talk about what happened to him as a child,
Well, I
basically.
think you rightfully point out it's the key to understanding him. Even though he himself disavowed his early years, he grew up in Germany during the rise of the Nazi Party. His family was directly in the crosshairs, was directly impacted by the tightening noose of the Nazis around the Jews in Germany. So his father lost his job as a school teacher, and then bit by bit, the family started to lose their footing. They were very well established in Bavaria and Germany, and but like a lot of families, they were slow to see the writing on the wall. His dad was a loyal, patriotic German. It was his mother that said, "Oh my God, this is getting dangerous. We've got to get out of here." And they got out in the nick of time. The Kissingers left Germany 2 months before Kristallnacht, the pogrom that really kicked off the violence within Germany against the Jews. He lost, I think, 13, as many as 20, I think, members of his family in the Holocaust. They made their way to the United States. And what's interesting is that the lesson that Kissinger took from this, and by the way, one of the most remarkable chapters of his life is that within 5 years of coming to the United States, he learns English, he excels brilliantly in school, he enlists in the US Army, and he's made a US intelligence officer in his early 20s, whose job it is to denazify Germany. He has to interview suspected Nazis and ferret out whether or not they actually are Nazis or not. He's 21, 22 years old at this point, just removed from being the victim of the people he's now interrogating. Speaks to his meteoric rise. But again, the lesson that he took is the key thing. What Kissinger took from his childhood was that power and power alone can be a hedge, it is the hedge against evil, against totalitarianism, authoritarianism. It's not enough to have a sort of moral strength, a kind of democratic allegiance to democracy, small d. This is has to be countered with power. And sometimes that means dealing with people you don't otherwise like. It means making alliances you wouldn't, in the best case scenario, make. It's all in the service of a larger good, which is putting up guardrails, meaningful guardrails against the dangers and the violence that exists sort of endemically in the world.
To see him in just as you just described it, to see that play out in his life really gives context that, again, I thank you for giving that context to me. And I assume a lot of other people who watch this will feel that way as well. And also, part of that equation, in terms of his sense of the world and how he grew up in it, is that he sees the United States as this beacon, this only the one true place where might makes right, in a sense.
Yeah.
Is that a fair way to put that?
Yeah, I think that Kissinger believed, and there have many articulate people in the film who knew him well who say this, but Kissinger believed that this country was the great beacon of light in the world, and that what was in this interest of the United States was de facto in the interest of humanity, right? So therefore, you could do things that increase the security and power of the United States, even if perhaps they were a little unsavory or maybe even violated the principles the United States supposedly stands for. So there was the contradiction. And some people think it was cynical. Some people think it was realistic, realpolitik,
There
as
you
people
go.
called it. And you can break down on all sides of this. Now, in the positive column, Kissinger kept us out of a nuclear war. We kept out of a nuclear war, and Kissinger was largely responsible for that. And you can say the case ends there. That is enough for a career. Whatever else you say about the guy, he did that. And I understand that argument. And then there are people who say, well, that isn't enough. Who we are is what we do in the world. And undermining democracy in Chile or failing to intervene in a massacre in Pakistan or on and on, the prolongation of the war in Vietnam, the secret bombing of Cambodia, these are inexcusable. Some people have even used the word war crimes to describe them. I wouldn't go that far, but there is this sort of weird, paradoxical, almost tension in Kissinger's career. Like, if you look closely enough, you begin to see a lot of unsavory things. But if you pull back to the big picture, you see what he was doing and why he was doing it. And you have to tip your hat to the fact that he accomplished what he set out to do, but largely.
The opening to China is a huge
Exactly.
complex
And the,
legacy.
and the sort of détente with the Soviet Union, those two accomplishments primarily were the.
I was so heartened to see the people that you talked to in the film. I know for a fact, like people like Roger Morris and Peter Kornblum are among the people who have been ringing the bell on Kissinger's policies and how they so vehemently disagree with that assessment of him.
Yeah.
So I was thrilled to see people like that because sometimes these kinds of documentaries will turn into a love letter that does,
No,
that
no, no.
whitewashes this. And
We don't
so
do love letters. No.
yeah, no, and I know from your previous work that's not the case at all, but I want to reassure people because I'm among the people who bristle at the idea
Yeah.
of Kissinger being anything but what you described a second ago. But also, I'm willing and completely open to understanding all the context that you provide in the film, and I can't disagree with it. So,
Well, we don't we try not to make arguments on one side of the
right,
ledger or
right,
not. We try to show the
right.
man in full, and that means nobody is all good or all bad. I think, well, let me put an asterisk next to nobody, but very few, very few. And I don't think Kissinger was. I agree. I can see both sides of the argument, and my job as a filmmaker is to get as close to him as possible. And we were lucky to get people who worked with him for decades, right at his side,
His son.
some of whom I would say the majority of whom
Yeah.
were turned out to be strident critics of his, which says something right there. Like the people who work most closely with you end up thinking you're a liar and duplicitous. That says something. But also people who were close to him continue to this day to defend him adamantly, like people like Winston Lord. So there's this fascinating figure in the center of this who's neither black nor white, who's neither good nor bad in the traditional sense, but who expresses all the contradictions that are at the heart of our own country and our own foreign policy. And that's why he's so interesting to look at.
Yeah. And I would say, by the way, again, want to remind our listeners we're speaking with Barak Goodman. He is the director of this two-part documentary series that will be premiering on American Experience on October 27th, simply called Kissinger. I could not agree with you more in your assessment. And again, I'd like to think that I'm not the only one who is open to being proven to be incorrect about something, to be able to take in new information and understand it in another kind of context that I
Mm,
didn't have that information on. And I would think that is for a lot of people, I hope, that is their takeaway from this documentary series. Let's give Henry Kissinger the credit of being able to navigate the highest reaches of American politics and diplomacy and
yeah.
government for a long period of time in which he was considered invaluable to that.
Absolutely. I mean, this guy was, a rare combination of surpassingly brilliant academic sort of thinker, strategist, tactician. He had all those skills, but he also had the skills of an infighter politically and a sort of backroom brawler. He knew how to accumulate power to the National Security Advisor's staff and the office. He knew how to diminish the role of his rivals. He was very adept with secrecy, with leaking. He played the press like a Stradivarius. He knew how to kind of court the press and make them feel good and make them feel special. And they reported, what he wanted them to report. And he was also he was so witty and charming. He charmed Washington's social circles. He was a sort of favorite guest of all the salons and even the left wingers. He had this reputation as what he called a secret swinger, as sort of a ladies' man. This guy could play all the levers of power brilliantly in Washington, not so much cynically, but because he was convinced of his own brilliance and his own rightness, and he wanted to be able to exercise that in the government. So for him, accumulating power to himself was only in the best interest of the United States.
Yeah. And I also think the circumstances from which he came, his family fleeing Germany, when you get to a place like this and all of this has been afforded to you, you got to feel like you're playing with house money at some point.
Yeah, there's something to that. And but it's such an improbable story. Here's a guy with a thick German accent, and he's immediately sort of seems like the other, and yet here he is sort of right at the heart of the US government. I don't think there's ever been quite a figure like that. And his relationship with Nixon was just so interesting. It became such a key part of our film because he really sort of detested Nixon at first and sort of was very suspicious of him. He sort of made a lot of jokes about his paranoia, and Nixon was an easy target. But I think over time, they formed this grudging, almost then affectionate relationship where they really actually respected each other quite a bit at the end. And when Nixon went down for Watergate, Kissinger actually thought it was a tragedy for the country because he had come to respect this man who knew more about foreign policy, was more interested and engaged than any politician, let alone president, that he had seen in his lifetime. So that relationship really was fascinating.
Thank you. I was going to ask you, and you summed that up beautifully. There were points, well, they both were successful because of each other.
Yes.
Again, opening that door to China, beginning a relationship with them. That's a really interesting part of his
Mhm.
story, and it's a great part of the documentary Kissinger. And yeah, dealing with Brezhnev, that story about going out to the dacha and or dacha, whatever they're called, dacha, and shooting boar with Brezhnev. I mean,
Yeah.
that's where all the mythology of power comes down to. This guy likes to shoot boar,
Exactly.
Yeah,
And
so
drink vodka. Yeah. And Kissinger did, you're right, you're on it, Mikey. I mean, Kissinger did what he needed to do.
yeah,
He could play chess with the maestro. He could spar with the North Vietnamese negotiators in the most kind of subtle way. And he could drink vodka and get wasted with Brezhnev. And he did what he had to do, and he adapted himself chameleon-like to whomever he was across the table from. He formed one of his closest bonds with Anwar Sadat of Egypt. They were fast friends and had great respect for each other. So down the list,
yeah,
but there were times when he was bested. He didn't have 100% batting average or whatever you want to call it. There were times when he was outmaneuvered, particularly with the North Vietnamese. But for the most part, he was the master negotiator. He had the people wrapped around his finger. He could figure out what to say, how to say it, when to say it, to twist or bend history to his devices. And that's really what his great skill was. And it was a pleasure to watch him in action, so to speak. Sometimes it wasn't for the best ends.
yeah,
We can talk about that, but
yeah.
for the most part, it was for the greater power and reach of the U.S.
Yeah, I will say that about the North Vietnamese or the Vietnamese people. I mean, they fought off China a couple of times in their
Exactly.
history. I mean, they've been tested, and God knows what they went through. And I feel bad about myself if I didn't mention that the estimates of Vietnamese death during this period of time from when the French left to when the war was quote unquote settled was something in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 million people. So it was a not an inconsequential event in terms of the survival of that particular civilization or that society.
No, and you're exactly right. And I think Kissinger misunderstood that whole situation. He saw it in Cold War terms. They were proxies for a communist, sort of hegemony, but that's not what it was at all. It was a nationalist conflict in which the North Vietnamese believed that this was one country and needed to be reunited. And they were fighting with a passion and a zeal and a commitment that Kissinger had not understood.
Well, this is a wonderful look at the life and times of Henry Kissinger. As I mentioned, his son David is there to talk about his father. There's a lot of personal touches in the film, but at the end of the day, this is about a public figure, and this is a very comprehensive look at his life and his actions and the good, the bad, and the ugly, and all of it. So my hats off to you again.
Thank you.
Congratulations on a wonderful documentary series. It's a two-part series, again, on American Experience, beginning October 27th on PBS, on the treasured, the indispensable PBS. It has been an honor and a privilege to talk to our guests today about this wonderful documentary series, Kissinger. Barak Goodman, thank you so much for spending some time with us here on Cinemaphile.
Thanks so much for your interest and your intelligent questions. I really appreciate it.
You have been listening to Cinemaphile with Mike Kaspar, the place where you will hear from the best in independent documentary and foreign filmmakers. Please check out our previous interviews as well as upcoming interviews and special programming by going to cinemaphilepod.com. We are also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, searchable under Cinemaphile with Mike Kaspar. Until next time, thank you for listening.